Summerwoods Estate was a suburban development in the Midwest known for its charming, tree-lined streets, identical mailboxes, and carefully maintained yards. From a distance, the neighborhood looked like any other modern suburban retreat: freshly mowed lawns, bright planters, and immaculate houses in varying shades of beige and taupe. These features were the pride and joy of the local homeowners association, run by a small board of dutiful and occasionally overzealous residents. Among these neighbors was a woman named Carla Watkins, who had lived in Summerwoods Estate for decades and remembered the days before the HOA's rulebook became so thick it could be used as a doorstop. In her 60s, Carla was spry and friendly, always waving at passing cars when she went on her morning walks. Carla's slight limp never deterred her from those daily strolls, a routine she adopted after her late husband passed away. She found solace in greeting neighbors and breathing in the still fresh air that drifted across the suburban lawns. But Carla's presence in the neighborhood wasn't universally appreciated. She owned a battered old Buick, a 1984 Regal that her husband had once cherished. Though its exterior showed signs of rust and wear, Carla took pride in keeping the Buick running smoothly, paying careful attention to its engine, transmission, and all the inner workings that made the car more than just a hunk of metal, as some had called it. For Carla, the Buick represented fond memories of cross-country road trips she had taken with her husband and the promise that she would never forget the independence they once shared. The dissonance between the shiny SUVs that dotted every driveway and Carla's old Buick sparked the interest of certain neighbors. While most offered a tolerant shrug or even an appreciative nod at its vintage charm, there was one woman who made it her mission to disparage any perceived eyesore in the neighborhood. Her real name was Eloise Braxton, but nearly everyone, often behind her back, called her Karen. Karen wasn't always the most active volunteer in Summerwoods Estate. In fact, 5 years earlier, she had lived in another gated community on the east side of town. According to rumors, she left that neighborhood following a string of disagreements with the local association over landscaping regulations and mailbox placement. She came to Summerwoods Estate determined to get things right from the start, and that meant forging her path into a prominent leadership role on the HOA board as quickly as possible. In her mid-50s, Karen wore sleek suits to even the most casual neighborhood gatherings. Her short, carefully shaped haircut, highlighted in a shade that almost seemed too gold to be natural, was parted just so. She had the curious habit of looking through people rather than looking at them, as though constantly assessing their worth or potential threat to her worldview. When Karen moved into Summerwoods Estate, she wasted no time. She introduced herself to each family, always carrying a notepad to jot down concerns or improvements that she believed the new community sorely needed. The first item she demanded was a revision of the HOA's guidelines to prohibit any unsightly modifications or vehicles that could compromise the property values. Those words, unsightly modifications or vehicles, would become Karen's personal slogan. Neighbors soon learned that if Karen thought something was amiss, she would fight tooth and nail to eliminate it, or at least regulate it. And if the board hesitated to follow her directives, she had an arsenal of strategies: lobbying, intimidation, backroom complaining, pointed letters, and even phone calls to local authorities. She was relentless. In her early months on the board, Karen took credit for pushing through minor rules, limiting the height of lawn decorations, and ensuring that trash bins were hidden behind fences so they weren't visible from the street. Some neighbors, especially those who prized uniformity, praised her. But others, who valued personal freedom, found her approach obnoxious. The older residents, like Carla, remembered a time when Summerwoods Estate was freer, more relaxed. And while Carla never voiced open defiance, she often felt that the HOA was going too far. That old Buick quickly grabbed Karen's attention. She had glimpsed the car once or twice rolling through the neighborhood at a safe, steady speed. The chipping paint and oxidized chrome grille offended her sense of suburban perfection. In her view, Carla's beloved vehicle was a direct threat to the carefully manicured image Summerwoods Estate tried to maintain. Karen began dropping passive-aggressive comments at every HOA meeting. I noticed a deteriorating vehicle parked near the corner of Maple and Cedar. We should probably address it before it drags down our property values. No one initially responded. Most recognized Carla's right to keep her old Buick if it was properly registered and operational. Besides, Carla was well-liked for her kindness. But Karen pressed on, claiming that the Buick was no mere cosmetic nuisance. According to her, a rusting car invited potential damage to the environment, or worse, gave the impression that the neighborhood was going downhill. Karen's words were carefully crafted to instill fear and urgency in her peers. A few started to wonder if there could be truth in her statements. Maybe the presence of that old Buick was affecting their property values. So, a subtle tension began to form. People rarely confronted Carla, yet rumors trickled through the neighborhood. Is she going to move that eyesore somewhere else? Will she finally sell it? Carla, for her part, kept the Buick in her driveway only because her small, one-car garage was brimming with storage boxes. She had every right to keep it there, but each day, the air felt heavier with unspoken judgments. Over the course of several weeks, Karen ramped up a behind-the-scenes campaign to ban old or unkempt vehicles from being parked in plain sight. She proposed new amendments to the HOA rulebook, specifying that vehicles more than 20 years old should be kept inside a garage or be concealed with a car cover approved by the HOA board. When she presented this proposed rule during an official meeting, a handful of other board members expressed concern. "We can't just punish people for having older cars," said one member named Stanley. "What if that's their only form of transportation or they simply like vintage automobiles?" But Karen had a knack for disguising personal vendettas as general neighborhood welfare. "I understand your concerns, Stanley," she replied, tapping her meticulously manicured fingernails on the table. "But we're just trying to ensure that every home reflects the high standards that make our neighborhood so desirable. Vintage cars are fine, but if they're not maintained to a certain aesthetic standard, it becomes a problem for all of us." Though Karen failed to get enough votes to pass the amendment, she did win some grudging support. The board decided they would start sending letters to any resident whose car they deemed potentially detrimental to the community's appearance, urging them to seek immediate corrective measures. Karen spent hours drafting the letter, making sure it sounded formal, authoritative, and polite, but not too polite. Naturally, Carla was the first to receive such a letter. She found it folded neatly in her mailbox, with the HOA's neat letterhead at the top and Karen's signature at the bottom. It read, in part, "We have observed that the exterior of your vehicle exhibits excessive rust and visual disrepair. As such, we kindly request that you either store it in a garage, promptly restore it to an acceptable standard, or remove it from the premises to comply with our neighborhood's regulations. We appreciate your cooperation and look forward to working with you to keep Summerwoods Estate a wonderful place to live." Carla was crestfallen. She had never been scolded by any previous HOA boards. Her Buick might have been old, but she ensured it was fully operational, licensed, and clean of clutter. Yes, rust had settled in a few spots, but she had nowhere else to store it. And the notion of covering it with a tarp in her own driveway felt humiliating. She decided to phone Karen directly, hoping for a friendly conversation to clarify matters. But Karen was not in a friendly mood. "Oh, hello, Carla." Karen's voice came through in a composed tone. "Is this about the letter?" "Yes. It's rather upsetting to get such a note. My car has sentimental value, you see, and it's fully compliant with state regulations. But not with the standards of this community," Karen interrupted. "We have guidelines, Carla. You understand, don't you? I'm sorry, but are you planning to force me to hide my car just because it's not brand new?" "It's not just about brand new, dear. It's about preserving the harmony and visual appeal of Summerwoods Estate. I'm sure we can find a compromise. What do you propose?" Carla's tone was calm, but her hand shook slightly. "Store it, or repaint it. At least move it behind your house, someplace it won't disturb the neighbors." At that moment, Carla realized there would be no reasoning with Karen. The conversation concluded on a chilly note. Disheartened, Carla placed the phone back on the cradle and decided that, no matter what, she would not hide her cherished car from public view just to appease a woman who cared more about aesthetics than humanity. Word spread swiftly that Carla's Buick was at the center of a brewing conflict. Over the next few weeks, neighbors whispered about how Karen complained about the simplest of things, from the color of holiday lights in December to the pattern of a newly added fence. Some wondered if Carla would back down, but those who knew her best suspected she would stand her ground. The tension escalated when Karen began making unannounced visits to Carla's property under the guise of inspections. Karen would ring the doorbell at odd hours, clipboard in hand, launching into a stream of criticisms about Carla's yard or the condition of her driveway. "You know, the paint on your shutters is starting to peel," Karen would say offhandedly, as though she were doing Carla a favor. "You really ought to address that if you're going to keep living here comfortably." Carla tried her best to remain courteous. She would offer Karen water or even iced tea in the summer heat, but these gestures were met with polite refusals and a pointed glance at her watch. Karen would quickly leave, usually after taking photos on her phone, photos she would presumably show at the next HOA meeting. Eventually, Carla wrote a polite but firm email to the board, excluding Karen, who was known to read any message directed at her as an opportunity for debate. She explained that while she understood the HOA's desire to maintain appearances, her husband's old Buick was neither an unregistered clunker nor a hazard. She requested the board's understanding. To Carla's relief, a couple of board members expressed sympathy. They reminded Karen that an elderly resident's memories and rights mattered more than the fear of dragging down property values. Karen bristled at the pushback, but for a brief time, she seemed to let the matter lie, if only to save face. However, Carla's sense of relief would not last. Karen's compliance was as thin as the next page in her notepad. It was a mild autumn evening when the incident took place, one that Carla would never forget. She went to bed around 10 p.m., as usual, after watching her favorite late-night talk show. The streetlights cast a gentle glow on the neighborhood, and there was only the faint hum of distant traffic to break the silence. At around 2 a.m., a shadow crept along the side of Carla's house, carrying a can of spray paint. Dressed in dark clothing, the figure carefully approached the garage door. The older wooden panels were slightly warped with age, but still serviceable. That night, however, they became the canvas for a message that would shock the entire street come morning. In crudely scrawled red letters, the words read, "Stop your ugly vehicle." A second, smaller line beneath it said, "Leave or else." As quickly as the figure arrived, they disappeared, slipping into the darkness before any motion sensor lights could reveal their identity. All that was left was the harsh, jarring statement on Carla's garage, a message no one could mistake for a random act of teenage mischief. It was pointed, personal, and dripping with contempt. Carla woke up early, as she always did, to walk her small terrier, Daisy. She headed out the front door with a smile, her cane tapping gently against the steps. The moment she turned the corner to the driveway, her heart nearly stopped. She froze, staring at the violent splash of red on her once mundane garage door. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Her mind buzzed with questions. Who would do such a thing? Why? Was it truly about her car? Tears welled in her eyes. The stark fear that accompanied any act of vandalism was overwhelming. But combined with the personal nature of the message, Carla felt utterly betrayed. Her neighbor, Mr. Patel, who always rose early to jog, came upon the scene. He skidded to a halt, eyes wide. "Carla, my gosh, are you all right? What happened here?" Shaken, Carla found it hard to speak. Mr. Patel quickly guided her to the porch swing and offered her water from his thermos. Another passerby, Ms. Rourke, saw the commotion and rushed over. Within minutes, a small cluster of neighbors had gathered, murmuring in disbelief and anger. Though many suspected Karen's involvement, her hatred of the old Buick was an open secret. No one had concrete proof, and no one dared point a direct finger without evidence. They called the police. An officer arrived, took photos, asked Carla questions. She gave a shaky account of the feud with Karen, but also admitted she'd received no direct threats from her besides the official HOA letters. The officer jotted down notes, cautioned Carla to keep an eye out for suspicious activity, and assured her that they'd increase patrols in the area for a while. Carla felt numb. She gazed at the humiliating graffiti as neighbors patted her shoulder, murmuring words of encouragement. Then, in the midst of her despair, a surprising energy began to form. The neighbors looked at one another, exchanging silent understanding. They decided to help Carla repaint her garage door that very day. By mid-morning, half a dozen neighbors assembled outside Carla's house with brushes, paint cans, and tarps. Young couples who hardly knew Carla beyond a friendly wave offered to help. Retirees like Mr. Patel took the lead in organizing supplies. Even local teenagers showed up with music speakers to lighten the atmosphere. Carla, tears of gratitude in her eyes, apologized for the inconvenience, but the neighbors brushed off her concerns. "This is what a neighborhood does," said Ms. Rourke firmly. "We stand up for each other." They began by painting a base coat over the hateful red letters. Layer by layer, the menacing message disappeared under a soft, pale blue color. Then, someone had a creative idea. Why not add a mural depicting the very thing Karen hated, the old Buick? Carla laughed at the suggestion, and her laughter caught on like wildfire. A local art student, drawn by the gathering, offered to design a scene of classic cars reminiscent of the 1950s, complete with swirling lines and bright colors. "Let's do it," shouted Mr. Patel. "We'll show them what real neighborly love looks like." In a dazzling display of community spirit, they transformed the once plain garage door into a lively work of art. The mural featured a shining vintage Buick in the center, surrounded by stylized images of other iconic cars. Carla's old Regal might have had rust in real life, but here it looked bright and polished, a testament to memory, tradition, and style. Flowers, musical notes, and cheerful swirls were added around the edges, forming a vibrant border. Neighbors passing by paused to admire the emerging mural and offered to donate more paints or snacks. Within a few hours, the hateful message was thoroughly erased, replaced by an illustration so uplifting that people stopped just to take pictures. The mural didn't mock the original vandalism, it transcended it. It turned an act of intimidation into a celebration of individuality and communal solidarity. Karen heard the news through the HOA grapevine almost instantly. She was furious. She insisted on calling an emergency board meeting, claiming that unauthorized artwork on a garage door violated the association's rules regarding external home modifications. She marched over to the site in the late afternoon, dressed in her usual crisp blouse and carrying not one, but 2 clipboards. When she arrived, she stood at the end of Carla's driveway, arms folded. She demanded an explanation. Carla was inside with a neighbor, recuperating from the emotional morning. Mr. Patel, along with a handful of others, confronted Karen. "What is the meaning of this?" she said, her voice taut with anger. No one submitted a request for such a drastic change in the garage facade. "It was done to cover up vandalism," Mr. Patel replied calmly. "Surely you heard about that." "It doesn't matter," Karen snapped. "This mural is a blatant violation of Article 4, Section 12. No drastic exterior alterations without prior written approval from the HOA board." Another neighbor, an older man named Richard who rarely spoke up at HOA meetings, stepped forward. "Karen, we did this to help Carla. She's lived here longer than most of us. You've seen the threatening words someone wrote on her garage. This was our response: compassion, art, and unity. Are you going to punish us for that?" Karen pursed her lips. She glared at the newly painted garage door, fists clenched. The bright, swirling design seemed to mock her. She had hoped to shame Carla into submission, and instead, the entire community had rallied around her. Karen sputtered, flipping through the pages on her clipboards. She grumbled something about process and proper channels before stomping off without offering any real solutions. That evening, with tension still in the air, the HOA convened for an unscheduled meeting in the neighborhood's small clubhouse. Rows of folding chairs were set up, and a projector displayed the newly crafted agenda on a large white screen. Nearly every seat was occupied. Residents wanted to find out what would happen next. Karen took her usual seat at the long table facing the crowd, flanked by the other board members, though she was clearly in a foul mood. The discussion began with official matters, some talk about landscaping budgets, playground renovations, and monthly dues. But it was obvious everyone was waiting to address the elephant in the room: the vandalism at Carla's home and the subsequent mural. Finally, the board president, Todd Harrison, spoke up. "Before we wrap up, I believe there is another pressing issue to discuss. Karen has raised a concern regarding unsanctioned changes to a garage door. However, I also believe the act of vandalism that precipitated these changes deserves our immediate attention." Karen wasted no time. She stood, her posture rigid. "Thank you, Todd," she said curtly. "The graffiti incident is deplorable. No one condones vandalism. However, our bylaws explicitly state that changes to home exteriors, especially large-scale art projects, must be approved by the board. The newly painted garage at Ms. Watkins's home was done without any formal request. A murmur of discontent rippled through the audience. One resident raised a hand. "Karen, are you suggesting we punish Carla and the neighbors who helped her after she was threatened?" "Not necessarily punish," Karen replied. "But rules exist for a reason. If we don't follow them, we risk chaos." A woman named Linda, who had helped paint the mural, stood up, her voice wavering with emotion. "Chaos? What we saw was solidarity, Karen. A group of neighbors came together to support Carla in her time of distress." Karen rolled her eyes, though she tried to conceal it. Todd cleared his throat. "Let's take a step back. I suggest we put the matter to a vote. First, do we want to require Carla to remove or repaint the mural to a neutral color? Second, do we want to press charges or impose any fines for ignoring the usual approval process?" Before Todd could call the vote, Carla herself stood, leaning on her cane for support. Her face was drawn from the day's ordeal, but her voice remained steady. "I've lived here since the first row of houses were built. My husband and I were among the earliest residents. I've paid my dues every month, followed your rules, even when they felt excessive. Now, someone decides to spray hateful graffiti on my home, and my neighbors rush in to help. If that's not the spirit of community, I don't know what is. So if the board wants to fine me for having a mural that covers up threats, go right ahead." A hush fell over the room. For a moment, Karen looked triumphant, as though she was confident the board would side with her. But something shifted in the eyes of the other board members. Stanley, the same man who'd opposed Karen's car ban proposal, spoke. "I think we can all recognize that an exception is warranted here. Forcing Carla to repaint her garage after it was vandalized, especially when what's there now is a beautiful piece of art, would be heartless and unproductive. I, for one, see no need for disciplinary action." A scattered applause broke out. One by one, the other board members nodded their agreement. Karen's eyes blazed with indignation, but she stayed silent, perhaps realizing she was outnumbered and risking her reputation. Todd motioned for a vote, and the result was unanimous, minus Karen's abstention. The mural would stay. No fines, no further demands. While the immediate crisis seemed resolved, a lingering question remained. Who painted the threatening message in the first place? Some neighbors whispered their suspicions. Karen's fierce opposition to the Buick, combined with the content of the vandalism, pointed a big, blinking arrow in her direction. And yet, no one had seen her commit the act, and rumors alone didn't amount to proof. As days went by, Karen tried to put on a veneer of professionalism, but her frustration bubbled just beneath the surface. She doubled down on other HOA matters, sending out more notices about lawn maintenance, solar light fixtures, and the exact shade of white allowed for front doors. It seemed she was determined to reassert her authority wherever she could. Carla, meanwhile, found herself unexpectedly showered with support. People stopped to admire the garage mural, many asking if they could donate to keep it refreshed or to install a clear protective seal so it wouldn't fade. Some even told Carla how impressed they were by her resilience. More than once, she teared up at these acts of kindness. Still, an unsettling undercurrent haunted her. Whenever she went to bed, she worried about hearing the hiss of spray paint or the scuff of footsteps outside her window. Despite the sense of unity, Carla felt a certain vulnerability she hadn't known before. Mr. Patel offered to install a small security camera facing her garage, and Carla accepted with quiet relief. About a week after the vandalism, Linda, the neighbor who'd painted part of the mural, was walking her dog near Karen's house early in the morning. She spotted Karen rolling her trash bin to the curb. Something unusual caught Linda's eye. A small can of red spray paint fell out of the bin, clattering onto the sidewalk. Karen quickly snatched it up, glancing around to see if anyone noticed. She locked eyes with Linda for a split second, then dropped the can back into the bin, her face turning a bright shade of pink. Linda's heart pounded. It could have been a coincidence. Plenty of people use red spray paint for various projects, and it still wasn't proof that Karen had used it to vandalize Carla's garage. But the moment was suspicious enough that Linda's suspicion hardened into near certainty. She didn't confront Karen directly, but she made a mental note of what she saw. That evening, Linda confided in her husband. He agreed that the situation looked damning, but cautioned her not to incite a confrontation without more proof. They decided to keep quiet for now. However, Linda did share her suspicion with Mr. Patel and Carla, both of whom found it unsettling yet unsurprising. With rumors swirling, Karen found herself in a tighter social bind. People who used to greet her with polite nods started avoiding eye contact. At HOA meetings, the tension was palpable. Every time Karen raised her voice to critique some minor neighborhood infraction, folks would exchange knowing glances. A silent question hung in the air. Is she the one who defaced Carla's garage? The old Buick, ironically, became more popular than ever. Teenagers posed next to it for playful photos. One neighbor, who owned a small towing service, even offered to give it a fresh coat of paint at a discounted rate, only if Carla wanted it. Carla, however, decided to keep the Buick's exterior as it was, proud of its battle scars and memory-laden patina. It may not shine, but it's part of me, she explained. Karen tried multiple times to resurrect the anti-old car proposal in the HOA, but each attempt fizzled out. No one wanted to support an initiative that felt like an extension of the vicious attack on Carla's property, especially not after the board had shown such solidarity. Karen was left fuming, her frustrations mounting behind a tight smile and formal statements. Under the surface, Karen was nearing her breaking point. She had always prided herself on controlling every situation, on shaping the neighborhood to her liking. But Carla's unyielding stance and the neighbors' vocal support were an unexpected roadblock. The more Karen tried to assert her authority, the less it seemed to matter. One day, as Carla came outside to prune her rose bushes, she spotted Karen hovering at the edge of her lawn. The older woman sighed, preparing for another confrontation. But Karen didn't speak at first. She only stared at the Buick with an expression that combined anger and something else, fear. Is there something you need, Karen? Carla asked politely. Karen swallowed. She opened her mouth, closed it, then spoke in a low voice. I wanted to see if you'd reconsider hiding that thing. It's been quite a stir in the neighborhood. Carla tilted her head. Despite everything, she tried to keep her composure. Karen, I've made my choice clear. I'm not moving it, covering it, or giving it away. Karen's shoulders stiffened. She muttered something that sounded like, "You'll regret this," then turned and walked away, leaving Carla both puzzled and unnerved. As the weeks passed without any resolution to the mystery of who vandalized Carla's garage, the neighborhood settled back into a cautious normal. But the once pristine aura of Summerwood's estate was marked by an unspoken tension. At block parties and yard sales, folks would share hushed theories, often concluding with, "But we can't prove it's Karen." Meanwhile, Karen's facade continued to crack. She skipped a couple of smaller HOA committee sessions, citing a headache or pressing personal business. When she did appear, her normally immaculate attire looked slightly disheveled, and her face was drawn with stress. It seemed that the sting of social alienation and the unrelenting suspicion were wearing her down. Then came a critical turning point. Linda's husband discovered a partially deleted video on their home security camera footage from the night of the vandalism. He'd been upgrading their system's storage drive when he realized the old data wasn't fully overwritten. With some tech-savvy retrieval, he recovered a few frames showing a figure approaching Carla's garage. Though the video was too grainy for a perfect ID, the person's build and gait bore a striking resemblance to Karen's silhouette. The glimpses of the figure's face were inconclusive, but the hairstyle was short and suspiciously similar. This time, Linda and her husband brought the footage to the police. The officer in charge noted it as potential evidence, but cautioned them that it might not be definitive enough to press charges. Nevertheless, rumors spread that a video existed, and Karen's once firm hold on the neighborhood's reins began to slip even further. Realizing the precariousness of her situation, Karen grew desperate. She had pinned her identity on being the neighborhood authority, the one who kept everything in order. Now that role was threatened by a swirl of suspicion, half-whispered accusations, and the knowledge that many no longer took her seriously. Late one afternoon, Karen arrived at Carla's door unannounced. Carla hesitated but allowed her inside, mostly out of curiosity about what Karen had to say. The two women sat in the living room, a place filled with mementos of Carla's life, framed photos of her wedding, souvenirs from trips, and family portraits. Carla, Karen began, her voice trembling slightly. I know we've had our differences, but I'm here to straighten a few things out. Go on, Carla said cautiously. I've heard rumors. People think I did that. Karen gestured toward the garage, unable to say the words. I want you to know I had no part in it. Carla looked at Karen intently, searching her expression for honesty. If that's true, she replied, then I appreciate you saying so. But you must understand why people suspect you. You've campaigned against my car for months. You sent me letters, harassed me with inspections. You practically warned me you'd make my life difficult. Karen bristled. That's the HOA's role, Carla. It's not personal. Carla gave a sad smile. You might tell yourself it's not personal, but it felt personal to me, still does. Karen's eyes flickered with frustration. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she broke down. I'm divorced, she blurted, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. A few years ago, I lost everything in the settlement except my job at a local real estate firm. Since then, I've tried to control things in my environment. The HOA was my way of feeling in charge, of ensuring a sense of order. Carla softened at this unexpected confession. I'm sorry to hear that, Karen. But do you understand that your actions have hurt others in the process? Karen nodded slowly, tears now slipping down her cheeks. I do. But I swear, I didn't do that to your garage. I may have my faults, but I'd never commit a crime like that. Carla watched Karen intently. She felt a momentary pang of sympathy. Still, suspicion lingered. There was something in Karen's tone, an unsteady mixture of regret and desperation, that left Carla unsure whether to believe her entirely. Before Karen left, she made a final plea. Can you tell the neighbors I'm not some monster? Carla offered a gentle shrug. I'll tell them you came by. Whether they believe it or not is up to them. Despite Karen's emotional confession, most neighbors remained convinced she was the culprit. As the weeks rolled on, Carla's mural gained a life of its own. The local newspaper wrote a small article about community solidarity in Summerwood's estate, featuring a photo of the newly painted garage. Several residents mentioned how the mural made them proud to live in such a caring neighborhood. The old Buick itself became a minor local curiosity, with a few car enthusiasts stopping by to chat with Carla about its history. Karen, on the other hand, found herself more isolated than ever. She rarely ventured beyond her usual errands and board meetings, no longer bothering to greet people who clearly did not want to greet her back. Her presence at HOA gatherings became increasingly contentious. When she insisted on discussing lawn ornament regulations or pergola color guidelines, people sometimes rolled their eyes. The shift in power dynamics was palpable. The board members were no longer afraid to disagree with her. If anything, they relished the chance to prove they weren't under her thumb. One crisp morning, Linda was out walking her dog again when she noticed a moving truck outside a home on the next street over. A man she recognized as one of the newer residents was loading boxes. She recalled that this man, Kyle, drove a sleek new SUV but also kept an older sedan in his garage. She stopped to chat, and he seemed nervous, glancing around as though expecting someone to overhear. Are you moving? Linda asked. Yeah, Kyle said, wiping sweat from his brow. I had some issues here. It's not really the place for me anymore. Linda was puzzled, but she didn't press. When she turned to leave, Kyle cleared his throat, then spoke in a low, urgent tone. Look, I know you're friends with Carla. About that vandalism, I overheard my roommate bragging about it. Linda's heart leapt into her throat. What do you mean? Kyle glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. My roommate, Tom, has had some trouble with the law before. He's been complaining about Carla's old Buick for months. He hates seeing junkers parked around. I guess one night he got drunk and decided to take matters into his own hands. Linda's mind reeled. She had assumed Karen was responsible. She stammered. Why did he do it? Did Karen put him up to it? Kyle shook his head. He doesn't even know Karen. He just has a real hang-up about old cars. Calls them an eyesore. After the news stories about Carla's mural, Tom freaked out, worried he'd be caught, but so far no one suspected him. Linda asked if Kyle could come forward. He sighed. Tom's already left. Moved out last week. I'm getting out too. I don't want anything to do with this place anymore. But if the cops come asking, I'll talk. I don't think they'll find him. Linda hurried to share this information with Carla, Mr. Patel, and the few neighbors most involved in the aftermath. They were stunned. All this time, they had pinned the act on Karen, only to find that a random housemate in the neighborhood, someone fueled by his own distaste for old cars, had committed the crime. Carla felt an odd mix of relief and guilt. She recalled Karen's tearful confession and realized that maybe, just maybe, Karen had been telling the truth. The group collectively decided that they owed Karen an apology, or at least a clarification, after how they had ostracized her. Mr. Patel, Linda, and Carla visited Karen's house that same afternoon. They found her on the porch, methodically wiping down her potted plants, lost in her own troubled thoughts. "Karen," Carla began gently, "we need to talk to you." Karen stood up stiffly, her expression wary. "About what?" Carla took a breath. "We found out who actually vandalized my garage. It wasn't you." She explained the conversation Linda had had with Kyle. Karen listened in disbelief, tears welling in her eyes for a second time. After a moment, she looked away, her jaw tight. "You all thought it was me," she said quietly. "All this time, I've been treated like a criminal." Mr. Patel stepped forward. "We're sorry, Karen. You have to admit the circumstances, your feud with Carla, your obsession with property values, made you the prime suspect." Karen gave a short, humorless laugh. "I can't blame you. I did everything but pick up the spray paint can. But I swear to you, I had nothing to do with it." Carla reached out and lightly touched Karen's arm. "We believe you now. I'm truly sorry for the pain this caused. I hope we can find a way to move forward." Karen looked at the group, swallowing back a rush of emotion. She nodded slowly. I'd like that." News spread quickly that Karen had been exonerated. The real vandal, Tom, was nowhere to be found, though the police took Kyle's statement, and an investigation was technically still open. Most importantly, the blame that had hung around Karen's neck like a millstone was lifted. In the weeks that followed, Summerwood's estate saw a subtle shift. Karen, though still somewhat rigid in her adherence to rules, softened her approach. She even co-sponsored an amendment allowing for artful exterior modifications if they fostered community spirit and were not overtly commercial. The board, for its part, found ways to accommodate Karen's passion for orderly beauty while also respecting each resident's individual rights. Carla's mural became a local landmark. The HOA even included a small photo of it in their next newsletter, calling it a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience and unity. Carla herself felt a new sense of peace in her home. She no longer worried about late-night vandals, and she took comfort in knowing that even in the face of strife, her neighbors would rally to protect and celebrate each other. Karen and Carla didn't become best friends overnight. Their personalities were simply too different, but they reached a kind of respectful understanding. Every once in a while, Karen would pass by Carla's house and pause to admire the mural, her eyes lingering on the painted Buick that had, in a strange twist of fate, become a neighborhood icon. Life in Summerwood's estate returned to its routine of block parties, HOA meetings, and weekend barbecues, with the occasional bickering over hedge trimming or paint colors. But the memory of how the community had responded to an act of intimidation by creating something beautiful remained fresh in everyone's mind. Carla still drove her old Buick on short errands. Whenever she parked it in the driveway, it gleamed, rust and all, in the summer sun. She never bothered to restore the exterior. To her, every scratch was a reminder of the life she'd lived, the adventures she'd shared with her husband, and the victory she'd won against intolerance. And Karen, still known to many by that half-ironic moniker, continued on the HOA board, albeit with a more tempered perspective. Occasionally, she'd propose a rule that was a bit too stringent, and the board would politely shoot it down, balancing her desire for conformity with a newfound respect for individuality. Over time, she learned that genuine community spirit can't be legislated through endless guidelines. It grows from kindness, understanding, and the willingness to stand up against wrongdoing, together. In the end, the threatening graffiti that had once marred Carla's garage became the impetus for something far more enduring, a lesson in empathy and cooperation. By refusing to let an act of malice define them, the residents of Summerwood's estate transformed conflict into creation. And as for Carla's beloved Buick, it received more attention and admiration than it ever would have otherwise, reminding everyone that every once in a while, what seems like an eyesore to one person can be a treasure to another, especially when fueled by love and memory.